Canto VII of Limbus Company ended up being the bleed Canto of the game, with its new enemies, mechanics and identities drastically changing up the bleed team meta for the foreseeable future. At least half of the best bleed team is now entirely different from what it was a couple months ago, and the thinking around bleed and how it impacts encounters has changed as well. Today, I want to revisit the topic of the state of bleed teams, because now that Manager Don Quixote is out, I believe that bleed has seen its final transformation for the current season. I, of course, can be wrong, but I strongly doubt that any new identity released for this team will change the game up in a significant way. In this video, we will take a look at the best bleed team in my opinion, and any variations of it that can perform better in specific scenarios. We'll talk about the combat and support identities used for the team and what they bring to the table, as well as the ego skills that tie the team together. We will also go over its pros and cons, and when the team should be used for maximum efficiency. However, before we start, I have to tell you that a large majority of my viewers are not subscribed. If you find yourself coming back to my videos or end up enjoying this one, you should consider subscribing to not miss out on my new uploads. It helps me out a lot and takes just a second of your time. Without further ado, let's get back to bleed. Starting off, here's the team. Immediately, I have to say that this is only one of multiple options for bleed teams, so stick around until the variants section to see more options. This variant is built specifically to fight humans, as that type of encounter is the most prevalent in most game modes. Now, it might be difficult to tell who is on the combat lineup and who is supporting, so let me show you the actual combat team. You're going to want to run Dawn, Yi-Sang, Rodion, Roshu, Honglu and Gregor in that order. To help you understand why I picked these sinners, let me introduce you to the identities in question. First off, we have Don Quixote. I think this pick is pretty obvious. Upon her release, Dawn instantly became the new centerpiece to the bleed team, as she is able to clash very well and deals immense damage with the ability to hit multiple enemies at once. The reason why I put her in the first slot has been explained in my Manager Don Quixote video, which you should watch if you haven't already. But in short, you want Dawn to get a lot of hard blood quickly so she can start spamming her second skill. Speaking of the second skill, as you can see, there is no Barber Otis on this team. This means that Dawn's skill 2 will never evolve, which might look like a bad thing at first, but in reality allows you to stack up hard blood for its effects, and also gives you more damage overall, as you don't consume hard blood with the normal skill 2 and can keep using it over and over to hit 3 enemies. This results in much more damage than using her improved skill 2 to hit 4 enemies every once in a while, so consider Barberless Dawn your best friend when it comes to dealing huge damage to multiple enemies. Also, her improved skill 3 is an insanely strong nuke that instantly gets rid of one enemy on the field, so you should keep an eye on using the skill in between the AoE damage whenever you can. Next up, we have Rin Yi-Sang, who should not need an introduction. He has been the absolute GOAT of bleed ever since his inception, and some would say that he's the best AD in the game outright. Rin Yi-Sang's biggest claim to fame is his ludicrous damage, which comes from his reroll mechanic, which requires multiple effects to be inflicted on the enemy before Yi-Sang's second skill becomes fully consistent. However, damage is not all Yi-Sang is good for, as his second skill can inflict 3 bleed count pretty consistently, with around a 50% chance for 3 additional bleed count on top of that if he hits 3 rerolls. His first and third skills can also inflict bleed count, though they aren't consistent. However, they can easily set up his second skill, which, as I've already said, does a lot. For being able to dish out immense single target damage, while also inflicting a decent amount of bleed count, Ring Pointillist Yi-Sang gets a spot on the bleed team, as well as all of its iterations. The third slot goes to Princess Rodion, who acts as a pierce damage dealer as well as an offensive and defensive support. Her skill set allows Rodion to clash at great values, while buffing and healing her allies via her passive and skill effects. Rodia is a blood fiend, much like Dawn, so she needs a lot of her unique resource to function at her best. However, she is not as starved for Blood Fist as Dawn, and also not as generally impactful as Rin Yi-Sang, which is why she takes up the third slot on the team. But don't get me wrong, Rhodia is still an absolute powerhouse compared to the bleed identities of Season 4, and once she gets her Blooming Thorn stacks, one use of her empowered skill 3 often results in a triple stagger, if not in a triple kill. Her supportive value is also not to be taken lightly, as she can routinely improve Dawn's offensive parameters with her skill 2, and her skill 3 can result in up to 30% bonus damage applied to 2 whole turns. Defensively, Rhodia also synergizes greatly with Gregor, as she covers up the few weaknesses he has perfectly. In our 4th slot, we have Red Eyes and Penitence Roshu. She's had quite a big fall from grace, being brought down from the 2nd slot to the 4th. However, that only happened because the competition is much stronger now. Roshu herself is as powerful as ever. Much like Yi-Sang, Roshu specializes in physical damage. However, when inflicting bleed, she inflicts a lot more potency and no count, in stark contrast to Yi-Sang's kit. Roshu is also the one damage dealer on this team that doesn't primarily inflict pierce damage, and opts to hit enemies with blunt instead. You would be led to believe that Roshu needs to be placed higher to make use of her unique charge, but in reality, she functions just fine in the 4th slot. This is because of two things. First of all, Roshu's 2nd and 3rd skill function just fine without charge, and can still win clashes and deal good damage. And second, in a human fight you don't even need to hit serious skullbusters, as last week enemies tend to get one-shot by a normal skullbuster anyways, even in Canto VII. To fill the 5th slot on the anti-human bleed team, I have unearthed an identity that was released all the way back in Season 1. Now, this might be a bit of a controversial opinion, but I think Tintin Honglu has been waiting for this exact moment for far too long. Now that bleed has transitioned away from stacking count and more towards raw physical damage, while also getting multiple identities with AoE skills that let bleed excel in human encounters, Honglu seems to have finally found his home. Now, this might be only for this variation of the team, but it's still a huge win for all the 14 Tintin Honglu fans in the world. What Honglu brings to the team is simple. His 2nd skill can deal a huge amount of damage if used at the right time, and it's also a last pierce skill, so it goes into chains quite nicely. Additionally, Honglu's 3rd skill can act as pseudo AoE, as it gets reused once on kill. Mutilate can also be used to instantly roll an absurdly high number to beat a clash, and it's a gluttony skill, so it gets to help you use Yorian Merkala Dawn. The reason why I'm putting Honglu on the team and not someone like Ruin Otis or Armor Salt is because in human encounters, the basic power values of an identity are more important than the identity's ability to contribute to the stack of an effect. Tintin Honglu can roll 30 and hit for a couple hundred damage, and the others cannot. It's as simple as that. Last, the 6th slot goes to Priest Gregor. I think this slot is as self-explanatory as the first 3. Bloodfiends desperately need Bloodfist to be effective, and Gregor is simply a barrel of blood to them. He provides Bloodfist to the entire team, while also winning tough clashes and tanking hits whenever he can. If the battle has dragged on, Gregor can also hit with his improved skill 3, and deal the same amount of damage as something like a Skullbuster whenever needed. With the help of Dawn and Rhodia, Gregor is virtually unkillable and can soak up an insane amount of damage while your team goes for some kind of focus fire play. Gregor's huge amount of utility lands him a spot in pretty much every bleed team with Bloodfiends on it, and not just the anti-human squad. And these are the 6 identities that should be on your combat lineup if you want to fight humans with the Bleed team. However, Bleed can flex into pretty much any niche with the huge amount of available IDs for this archetype, which is why I want to move into the team variants section right now, and look at how Bleed looks when going up against other types of content. You won't be getting a breakdown of the roles of all the IDs for the team though, but you probably won't need it as most of the faces will stay the same. Starting with the boss fight lineup, 4 out of the 6 IDs from the anti-human team are staying. The IDs in question are Rin Yi-Sang, Manager Dawn, Princess Rhodia and Priest Gregor. Roshu and Honglu are going to be replaced with Arcorp Mersault and Ring Pointylist Otis. These two identities excel at inflicting bleed count, which is an important part of fighting bosses with the bleed team. What you lose in physical damage by taking out Roshu, you more than make up for in bleed damage and conditionals by picking up Otis and Mersault. Additionally, Mersault can deal immense damage with his Yearning Merkala ego, and Otis helps set up Ringy-san, who is actually going to be the main damage dealer in this case, as Dawn's multi-target skill tool no longer gives her an advantage when fighting bosses. This is also a good time to go off on a tangent about the two ways you can use bleed in Limbus Company. As you can see, I picked identities with high physical damage for the first team. However, I'm giving priority to bleed count infliction when making the second team. Why is that? Well, that's because when building a bleed team, you can adopt two mentalities as to what purpose the actual bleed effect will serve in your team. The first option is bleed as a tool. If you are using bleed as a tool, your team wants to maximize bleed count, as that effect will end up dealing most of your damage to the enemy. When playing for bleed as a tool, identities with below average stats but good bleed infliction become very valuable. The line of thinking is: Armor Soul's second skill might not be particularly powerful, but it can inflict up to 4 bleed count. With 50 bleed potency stacked up, this results in 200 more damage being added into the stack, which suddenly means that Mersault's skill 2 is actually dealing a lot of effective damage. This kind of line of thinking has been the main way to go about using bleed ever since Library of Ruina, as playing for that effect allows you to win fights even if you keep losing clashes, meaning it's the best option for underleveled players to go much further into the game than they are supposed to. For fully leveled players, using bleed as a tool is still the best option when fighting bosses, as a boss will flip a bunch of coins every turn, which results in that boss taking a giant amount of bleed damage throughout the fight. This is the OG bleed, and this is how people are used to looking at the effect. However, more and more extremely powerful identities are added into the roster, and more of them get kits that lack bleed count. This has led to the creation of a new line of thinking: bleed as a resource. When using bleed as a resource, the damage of the effect itself becomes much less of a priority, and the purpose of bleed is changed entirely. Instead of building up a huge stack and forcing one enemy to take a lot of damage over and over, bleed can be used to hit conditionals for skill effects of strong identities, who can in turn get a lot more effective value from a small amount of bleed on the enemy. This idea is especially effective when using Bloodfiends, as they don't just rely on bleed on their main target, but instead use Blood Fist, which is pretty much the bleed used during an encounter to empower their attacks and deal a lot more additional damage. Bleed as a resource is more effective against human encounters, as it's almost impossible to keep up a meaningful stack of bleed on multiple enemies at once. And with how strong a lot of the new bleed identities are, I would argue that running a resource bleed comp against last week bosses is also better, because you get to clear such encounters much faster with physical damage. Now all of this is to say that bleed is not Rapture. You are not entirely bound to maintaining count, and as long as you think of bleed as a resource to get you to the big damage numbers, you can easily succeed in using this team anywhere you want. That being said, let's get back to our team variants. Yeah, the thing I was talking about before I had to get that last part off of my chest. There's a third type of team I run for Mirror Dungeons specifically. It consists of a mix of both the human and boss teams, with the core 4, Roshu and Armor Salt. This composition gives you access to all the most broken ego skills for the team, which is something you should be abusing in the Mirror Dungeon game mode. Alternatively, if you don't have Yearning Merkala Mersault, did not get Archer of Mersault, or for some other reason aren't running him, you can swap him out for Pekot Captain Ishmael, who can destroy enemies in the Mirror Dungeon with her skill 3 and also has access to a strong recovery ego skill in Blind Obsession. All three teams can be modified to your liking, with units swapped out for ones you find more enjoyable to use. Also, you can always handpick the final slots depending on the enemies you're facing, so that you always maintain a damage type advantage. Now, I want to take a look at the support identities for the Bleed team. First off, we have the SP healing backbone of Bleed, the one who grips Faust. Her support passive allows her to heal 15 SP on one ally with the lowest SP every time you get 3 last resonance, so you pretty much get 15 SP every turn. Next, if your Roshu is benched, meaning that you're running the anti-boss team, she should be set to Kurakumo for additional bleed infliction. Whenever you're fighting humans and have Mersault benched, you should set him to his middle identity, as it helps your Blood Fiends reach 45 SP much quicker. Honglu should be set to his Kurakumo ID much like Roshu, as he also increases the bleed infliction of one ally. Heathcliff's best option is still Arcorp, as he can increase the pierce damage of the fastest ally, which will often be Dawn. However, this effect is kind of hard to get online, unless you're running both Ring Otis and Dawn in an encounter that gives additional slots. Now, Ishmael doesn't really have any good options. Your best bet is Arcorp, as she gives blunt damage to the ally with the least SP, which can sometimes work, but takes a long time to even activate and isn't consistent at all, and it also brings very little value. You can alternatively use Pekot Captain Ishmael, but not as a support. She can fill the 7th slot on the team in case anything goes wrong. It's not very valuable either, but as I've said, Ishmael lacks good options. Sinclair used to be in the same boat, with no really useful support ideas for the Bleed team. However, now that Bleed is also good against humans, you can use Los Mariachis Sinclair to give one ally with the most HP some extra damage. Last we have Otis, and whenever she's on the bench, she can run 2 identities, Ring and Barber. Ring provides SP healing on kill, and Barber provides HP healing with the same condition. I usually prefer Ring over Barber here, but you can choose the option you like the most. If you are very low on Otis IDs, some backup variants are Blade Lineage and Base Otis, as they can also provide some value with their damage increasing passives. As for the ego skills that you should be actively using, this team has a few. First of all, Yonin Mercala Don Quixote is your strongest tool for clearing human encounters. It deals a huge amount of damage and works really well with the last chains that Bleed is known for. It requires some gluttony to use, which isn't super easy to come by, but my Honglu pick was partially made because he can help fuel Yonin Mercala. A very similar tool is Contempt or Ryosho. This ego skill also acts as a multi-target nuke, but this one requires last resonance to even function. If you have a large amount of ego resources, you can use the 2 nukes in tandem, while also adding a super bad Garden of Thorns to the combo for maximum destruction. However, if you're fighting a boss, the previous 2 options won't exactly prove very useful, and instead you have 2 more ego skills that can help the team out a lot. The first one of those is Yonin Mercala Mersault, a powerful WoW level single target nuke. This skill deals immense damage by gaining coin power against enemies with Bleed, but also by activating Bleed on the enemy prematurely, making them take a lot more damage if you have a good stack ready. The debuff that is inflicted by this ego is also not to be taken lightly, as it can help with further Bleed stacking and can deal even more damage. And if you got unlucky with your skill rotations, and the boss is about to reset the entire Bleed stack, Sanguine Desire can come to the rescue. This Rodion ego skill forces an enemy to not consume Bleed count when taking damage for a turn, and also deals additional damage if the enemy has a lot of Bleed. You can combine Yonin Mercala Mersault and Sanguine Desire Rodion to get a full Mersault nuke off without ruining your stack, thus making this combo a very potent tool for boss fights. And with that, we have reached the final part of the video. Where can Bleed be used? And you can probably guess by now that the answer is everywhere. Bleed is the signature team of the newest Canto, meaning it's getting all the content. On top of that, the team was already playable before Season 5, so it now has far too many options for teams, while some forgotten archetypes starve. That being said, Bleed is still primarily a boss killing archetype, as the damage of the effect cannot be resisted, and thus works on every boss equally well. The physical damage, on the other hand, suffers when going up against last and/or pierce resistant enemies. Don't get me wrong though, the physical damage of the team is crazy, and it's definitely up there as one of the best anti-human archetypes in the game. It's just that this statement probably won't hold up for very long. But even in Canto 8, 9 and so on, Bleed will remain a premier pick for dealing with bosses. And with that, this video comes to an end. Bleed is an extremely powerful archetype in Season 5, and is probably the best team available at the moment. It can find success in any kind of content, as both the identities and ego skills of this team are insanely cracked. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, leave a like to let me know. Also, if you want to see more content like this, consider subscribing, and if you disagree with me or have something to add, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below, and I'll gladly engage in discussion with you. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you soon. Goodbye!